Tried to film this video like 13 times. Hello everyone, my name is Criminal Ambivalence, and I have been reading the Bible, and many of you should know that because in many of my videos I've talked about the Bible and manga, anime, and how they intertwine together. But more specifically, I've been reading the Bible front to back, so from Genesis to Revelations, and I am not that far in. I've read the first five books plus Joshua. If you don't know, that is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus is next, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, followed by Joshua. And I wanted to talk about my experience with that, how that's affected my faith as a Christian, and more interestingly, how we can analyze the Bible as like a work of fiction. Even though as a Christian I don't believe the Bible is a work of fiction, I think it's still written more as a fictional piece than like in the style almost of a fictional piece. That might be controversial for me to say, but there are definitely literary elements and theological elements throughout that sort of change the way you have to go about reading the Bible. So, the first thing I wanted to talk about is just what my thoughts of each of the major books are and what impact they left on me. So, let's start with Genesis. Genesis is my favorite book of the first five. If you're going to read anything from the Old Testament, Genesis is a good start. It's very quick. In the other books, it gets very slow, as we're going to talk about. But Genesis has a lot of interesting history and some of the most, what I would call, mythical elements. So a lot of people don't know this, but there are a lot of weird esoteric stuff in the Bible because people associate the Bible primarily with the New Testament. Most Christians don't even know very much about the Old Testament. But then, or they might know something like the Nephilim or something like that. But in Genesis, it kind of lays out something that's more interesting than that, which is like a spiritual pantheon. Many of you might have heard something from anti-apologetics or from biblical apologetics about how the Bible has other gods in the Bible besides God, as in Yahweh or, the God of the Bible, which is an interesting critique for sure. And what's funny about it is it's not exactly incorrect, but it is incorrect in sentiment. So the way I have understood, and again, before I say anything, all these takes are not from a biblical expert. I'm just a layman. I didn't do research. This is just, I read it. This is my takeaways. But the Bible sort of exists within a spiritual pantheon, and that becomes really obvious in Genesis, where there are kind of levels of beings. And the way I read it is that beings are powerful or more powerful, less powerful based on their temporal or spatial confines. And so what that means is the more a spirit exists in our place and time, the less powerful it essentially is, while beings that are like God that exist without space and time are more powerful. And there's something called angelology, I think is what it's called, that kind of reaffirms this. That a lot of the angelology actually is not in Genesis, but it's important. Genesis kind of sets out that there are other gods that kind of reside over geographic areas. And to me, that reads more that, like, within the spiritual pantheon, God is at the top, and He is the writer of everything, the writer of life, and the creator of the spiritual realm. But what He is the only powerful being, right? And so He has created these other beings that have dominion over geographic areas and their own characters, who are not always in line with God. Like they have a certain amount of free will in the same way we have free will to reject or accept God. Like when they talk about the God of the pharaohs in Genesis, I believe those gods were real. Like it wasn't just like God was saying that these gods are fake. Like their people were actually doing actual magic and stuff. And so that implies that there's a power structure within the spiritual landscape that we don't get a lot of detail into. And so that's the first thing that's very interesting is that we exist within a spiritual soup where a lot of things are happening that we don't quite understand, where there are different spiritual entities that control geographic areas, right? And this kind of, in a Christian perspective, might explain why different parts of the world have different cultural or like a different character. Like you might say that like Russia as a country has a different character than the US as a country, and that might be because there are spiritual entities that actually govern over these worlds or over these geographic areas, and have influence over these things. But that is just an interpretation of how you could read it. That isn't necessarily like you have to believe if you're a Christian or something. It's just something how I read that. The next thing that a lot of people talk about is the Nephilim, which I found kind of an interesting. Like it's just a blip. If you don't know, the Nephilim are like kind of angels come down and have kids with like people and have these kind of giant babies that it's kind of confusing. I think it could either be read that they're like great men, and they're sort of being mythologized here. Like it's very clear that in Genesis you have some of the most ancient stories, and there's a lot that's being pulled on that isn't really expanded upon later, and so there's a lot for us to speculate on. And then we have the stories of the patriarchs, which I believe include, oh, I'm going to get this wrong, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, he wrestled with God, Joseph, and then Moses. If I missed one, lambast me. I found it surprising how pathetic a lot of the patriarchs really were. Like there are multiple times where a patriarch is scared that people are going to kill them because their wife is so hot. This is true. And so what they do is they pretend that their wife is actually their sister, and a lot of times it seems that the people that try to flirt with the patriarch's wives are like, why didn't you tell us this? But they're just kind of cowards a lot of the times, which kind of speaks to, God uses us to do things even when we're cowards, which I guess is a hopeful message. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say about Genesis. There's a lot of things to say, but this is just my large overview. I don't have anything else to say about Genesis right now. I might come back to Genesis in later pieces. There's so much to say about it, but I think those are the things that I personally found most interesting. I was really interested in the spiritual backdrop and just the history leading up to everything. I also find a lot of the stories in Genesis to be sort of allegorical. Like a lot of people read stories like the Tower of Babel to be literal history, while I don't. Like it was very clear when reading it that it was very poetic and not necessarily true in any meaningful sense. I mean, there might be some literal truth behind it, but it's poetic structure. I think it was trying to make theological points rather than historical points. But again, I could be wrong. I'm kind of a baby theologian. Like some people view the Bible through a certain lens, like I'm a Lutheran, so I believe this or that. While I'm just kind of coming at it as I just opened the book, I read it. What did I take away from it? Okay, so let's go to Exodus. Exodus is probably my second favorite book of the Bible. We'll get to why there's things I don't like about it. So the escape from Egypt is one of the most interesting stories in the Bible. In the Bible, there are basically two stories that matter the most. There is the Exodus, and then there is the resurrection of Jesus, right? Like I think the narrative of the Jews escaping Egypt is just foundational for all of Christian and Jewish history. And so, also Moses as a foundational figure is just so compelling, and like escaping from oppression is something that I think most people can relate to on some level. I don't have a ton to say about it when it comes to just story elements. I think Exodus is more of a straightforward narrative than Genesis, because Genesis is covering a lot of bases. Like you're going through the flood, you're going through Adam and Eve, even the spiritual pantheon, all the patriarchs, and Joseph and the beginning of Moses. Like you kind of go through a lot of history really fast. One thing that does suck about Genesis is like there'll be something really interesting and they'll spend one chapter on it, and then they'll go over like negotiations over wells, and they'll spend 3 chapters on that. It's like, can you write more about the interesting stuff and less about well rights? But that's just my personal opinion. Yeah, Exodus is compelling, and their escape from oppression is just the foundational narrative of the West. The idea of rising up against tyrannical forces to seek something better is just a foundational narrative in all Western thought. And so going forward from that, the last third of Exodus is probably the most boring piece of literature ever written. And what it is they talk about building the tabernacle. And if you don't know, the tabernacle is like a shrine that they carry around where God resides and talks to the Israelites. It's interesting as a concept, but they spend maybe it feels like 20 chapters or something describing on how to build the tabernacle. Like if you gave me enough money, a trip to Home Depot, I could build the tabernacle from scratch. Like they give so much instructions on how to build that stupid, like obviously the tabernacle is a holy structure, but I did not need to know how to build it with units and direct instructions. And maybe this is just a Christian view, because I know in Jewish history this is probably more substantial, because Jewish philosophy is a lot more rule based, while Christian theology tends to be more virtue ethics, which is an interesting discussion for another day. So maybe it makes more sense in that context. I'm not sure. Maybe they find it boring as well, and I'm just talking out my ass. But in general, I just found the end of Exodus to be the most boring thing I've ever read in my entire life. But then we get to Leviticus, and so there's this period of the Bible that's the last third of Exodus to Leviticus to the beginning of Numbers, which might be the driest reading that God or man has ever done. And so let me tell you something. If you're out there and you're like, Christian, non-Christian, doesn't matter, and you say to yourself, I want to read the Bible to understand it, do not read the Bible front to back. It is a painful endeavor. I would not wish it upon my worst enemy. I think the Bible's really interesting. I love the Bible. But also, that middle chunk of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books, is horribly boring. It just is. Because Leviticus is all the Jewish law that does not apply to Christians. There's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to go into it here. A lot of people think Leviticus is kind of backwards, and I guess in a modern framework, it sometimes is. Basically, Leviticus is all the priest rules, all just the rules to live by. And like there are rules about, for example, slavery or something like that, which obviously all of us would not support slavery. But I will say the rules for its time were fairly progressive, actually, which is kind of hard to understand as a modern audience. Later, there's a quote from Jesus later in the New Testament talking about how the Old Testament laws were not perfect, but more God progressing the laws. And you might go, why not just give a perfect set of rules in Leviticus and not wait till Jesus? And it's because the Jewish people's hearts were hardened in the Bible. I'm not talking Jewish as in modern Jews, so let's not be anti-Semitic here, but like the Jewish people as described in the Bible, their hearts were hardened. And so they could barely follow the rules at all. Like when Moses gets the 10 Commandments, which I believe happens, I want to say it's in Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers. I don't quite remember. He gets the 10 Commandments and he comes down from Mount Sinai, right? And he took 3 days to build these 10 Commandments. And while he was doing that, the Jewish people literally built a gold statue to worship other gods. So the God of the Bible freed them from Israel, fed them every single day, split the Red Sea, had a massive amount of miracles, and the moment they got bored, they started worshiping other gods. And so that kind of gives you a framework of why God was unable to enact a perfect plan or a perfect set of rules to the Israeli people or the Israelites at the time, because their hearts were hardened and they couldn't even follow the most basic commandments, which is there shall be no other above me, right? So that's a good thing to remember when you're reading Leviticus, if any of you actually ever read Leviticus. Then we go into Numbers. Numbers is called Numbers because it starts with a big census, and it talks about all the people in each of the 12 tribes of Judah or something like that. I hardly remember at this point. It is quite boring. And Numbers is also where they're all stuck in the desert. So God tells Israel, you got to go invade these people because I have these promised lands for you. And they get scared and don't do it. And so their punishment is to walk around in the desert for 40 years. And man, is it boring. I will say the one interesting thing that happens in Numbers, and this also might be in Exodus as well, is this guy's named Balaam, or Balaam, or Balaam. I have no idea how to pronounce it. We're going to call him Balaam for now. Please lambast me in the comments if I got that wrong. I'm hoping none of you know anything, and so just take my word on everything. But basically, the entire Old Testament narrative is God's relationship to the Israelites, and how they're his chosen people, right? And so there's not a lot of mention about other people groups, and if there are other people groups mentioned, it's usually in a negative light about how they're persecuting the Jewish people, or like Sodom and Gomorrah, where they're completely deprived or depraved, or I guess deprived and depraved. And so Balaam is interesting because he's a diviner. Basically, he's a person who deals in the spiritual in another kingdom, and God works through him to help the Israeli people and to bless the Israeli people. It kind of shows that God has interactions with people outside of just the Israelites. And this kind of leaves the door open that God could be interacting with people all over the world before the New Testament, right? And having relations with all of his people, even if not directly. So that's really interesting. Balaam is later killed by the Israelites in Joshua, so he does something wrong, I forget. But he just is a really interesting character. The other interesting thing about him is that some of you may know the story of the talking donkey. He's the person who rides the talking donkey. That's a really interesting story. So if you don't know, God sends Balaam to do something, and he puts him on this donkey. And then this angel is about to kill Balaam, like sent from God. So basically, God is about to kill Balaam for doing what he told him to do, which is really confusing on its face. But in the narrative, it's kind of clear that Balaam's heart is just not in the right place. And so there's something about like kind of a narrative there where even if you're doing the right thing, if your heart's in the wrong place, it's almost as bad as doing the wrong thing. And obviously the talking donkey saves him from being slaughtered by the angel. And so God protects him in the end. But it does exemplify an interesting point. Moving on, there is one really weird story I want to talk about that I don't have a good explanation for. So there's the scene where Israel is rebelling against God. These snakes are biting all of Israel. I'm so bad at this game if you guys are watching the gameplay. But basically, they rebel against God. I forget what they did. They did like 10,000 things wrong. But this time, God sent a bunch of snakes to bite them, to punish them, right? And to stop the snakes from biting them, they had to make like a pole with a metal snake on top of it and look towards the snake. And once they did that, all the snakes went away. I have no idea what that means conceptually, metaphorically. Maybe you have to face your fears or conceptualize your fears to be able to face them. Or that's the best I got for you guys. So I'm sure there's some great literature on what that exactly means, but I am not smart enough to figure it out. Okay, finally Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a weird book because Deuteronomy is one long speech. So Moses is about to die. And so Moses comes down and gives all these speeches about how they need to conquer ancient Palestine, right? And he basically talks about the history, tells them to remember all the covenants between them and God, all this stuff, right? And that's about it. It's kind of a summary. Like I know in critical scholars or whatever will talk about JEDP, or there's a bunch of different versions of this theory, and basically it's that the Pentateuch, or sets of authors. I think it's the Yahwehist, which means people that use the word Yahweh, which is the divine word for God. I actually tried not to use that word too often, even though I've used it in this video because it's kind of sacred for Jewish people. There's the Elohimists, which is the E, which are people that use the word Elohim to refer to God. And so supposedly those are two different sources, I think from northern and southern Israel, that tried to come together. D is the Deuteronomist. So D is and basically they just wrote Deuteronomy. And so supposedly this book of speeches, which is very different from the other four, just in composition, is supposedly written by a different group of authors, which is interesting. I don't know if I believe that, but it's just something interesting to consider while I talk about these things. And then final is the priestly source, or I believe it's also called the redactor source, and they're the ones who compiled, added things, and stuff like that. And there also are other influences in the Bible that are very obvious to see. For example, the Hammurabi Code is basically copy and pasted at one point in the, I think in Leviticus it is. Again, like, it all kind of blends together for me now. And so also the interesting thing about Deuteronomy is it's basically Moses hyping up all the Israeli people to go and slaughter the Canaanites, which is basically what all of Joshua is. And so this is where we get into some moral territory and a lot of is the Bible backwards, basically talk. So in modern terms, what the Israelites continue to do to the Canaanites is a genocide. They completely wipe out the Canaanites to take their land and basically destroy them all. One of the main things that the Bible teaches, it's like one of the first thing, which is kind of the most revolutionary things about the Bible, is that man was created in God's image. And so that means human life has value intrinsically because we are children of God, while other moral systems don't really have that essential doctrine. And so this is why in the West we have some like rights-based systems. Rights-based systems don't really come about until you believe that human beings have intrinsic value of some sort and like have a divineness to them. So, anyways, I say this all to say that it seems kind of counterintuitive that the same book is talking about, taking out large amounts of people. And so, what is the moral justification from the Christian side? I don't know what other people would argue. So here is criminal ambivalence's best go at how to think about this. So, as God created all life, right? He's the author of life, and He is the ultimate good, definitionally. Like, God is good in the Bible, definitionally. Everything He does is good, definitionally. He is incapable of doing wrong. And so, as the author of life, He can simultaneously take life away with perfect utility. There's nothing wrong with God ending life, as again, He was the author of it. And so I think it can be difficult for a lot of non-Christians to understand that because they're like, isn't this a terrible thing? And it's like, well, you got to think that like to Christians, death isn't the end. And so even though these people got killed, like God might have had a plan in store for them. And also like the price of sin is death, right, for all. Or even hell, right? And so the price for sin in this life can also be death. You can understand how an atheist might say, well, you can rationalize anything if you say, well, God told me to do it, which I think is true to some extent. Like there, you got to give the devil its due, quite literally. But I think when you actually get to the New Testament, like none of this stuff would ever be permissible, and it was only permissible in a certain context at a certain time. And so what we're really rationalizing was God's commandments moral at the time in the Old Testament. And so one thing to consider is like what makes something moral or not moral, like objectively speaking. I would argue that there is no, like outside of like a God-based morality, there is no objective reasons that things are good or bad. You can just say they accomplish your goals or not. Like maybe your goals are to have as little people starve as possible, right? Like that's not a bad goal at all. And you could make a system that makes everyone get fed so no one starves. And we could say that's good, right? But there's no objective reason why people not dying or dying is better or worse. Like we can't say that human value or human life has an objective value in any sense. Like I believe human life has objective value, and most people have the intuition that human life has objective value, but it's not objective in the same way that like 1 + 1 = 2 is objective. It's more just such a deep intuition that we hold it as close as true. But that is definitely different than what true is. Because if someone said, I actually think a system that starves the most people is good, you could say no, because that kills more people. And they could say, well, why is killing less people a good thing? Well, because human life has value. And then someone could say, why does human life have value? And you might be able to come up with a reason, but it probably wouldn't be an objective reason or a reason you could prove. It's probably more falls into a system of beliefs, which is kind of why I don't like humanists. It just seems like their philosophy kind of falls apart when you get to the bottom of the barrel. Like you have to make certain assumptions that things have value, which isn't necessarily true, and so, it's good that we all assume that human life has value, because then, it'd be Mad Max out here. But yes, anyways, this is all to say with the morality of the Bible, like God is the ultimate authority. He's the author of life. He can give and take life as he pleases, and his morality is always positive. And so, even though the the actions of the Israelites in Joshua seem grotesque in our frameworks, given a biblical morality, that's not necessarily true, and I don't think you can necessarily disprove that framework even if you dislike it per se. It is something difficult to wrestle with. It's something I wrestle with. Again, these aren't perfect answers, and I'm not a theologian. I'm not someone who does apologetics. I'm just a dummy who watches a lot of anime and happens to read the Bible. Okay, so after that, Judges starts, and I have not started Judges. I'm about to. But this video is really for me to write down or just on the cuff explain my feelings of the Old Testament after I read them, or the first 6 books of the Old Testament while I read them. And so maybe my opinions will change, or maybe I'll make another update, but for now, I think that's going to be all for me. Thank you very much.